I'm Sonja Corbitt, Catholic Evangelista, here to talk to you today about how to rest from anger. Now, this is a subject I have a lot of experience with because this has been probably the number one subject of my entire formation with God to this point. I have what I call a father wound, and that father wound made me extremely angry. I was militantly feminist, militantly everything. I didn't think that was the case at the time. I thought I was very passionate. However, very quickly, I started to see that my anger was starting to, not just that it had started to, it was controlling me, and it was starting to really damage my relationships, my marriage. And the thing that really scared me was I began to notice that I had started to parent my children the way I had been parented. And I was scared to death that I was going to pass on the same wound to my kids that had been given to me through my father, which I know now was also a generational wound. So how in the world can someone who is in the grips, the depth of what I will admit and confess was not just anger, it was rage, it was wrath, the kind that runs other cars off the road, gets into fistfights, breaks things, you name it, I've done it. I have actually physically attacked my husband. I'm not proud of that. I'm just saying, I'm telling you to show you that God can and He will and He wants to heal you of the wounds that are underneath that kind of explosive anger. Now, one of the things that was very interesting to me is that there's a whole lot of angry people in the Bible. I focus my ministry on what the Bible teaches and what God says about stuff. And I do so because the scriptures are how God has healed me in the vast majority. So as I began to sort of talk to God about my anger, it really came to a head for me when I came home. My husband and I got married, and my father did not come to our wedding. And that was a huge sore spot for me. It hurt me deeply that he didn't. And we hadn't spoken since then. First of all, he was in 3 branches of the military and then also highway patrol. So if we knew anything at our house, it was how and why you always obey the law. We knew the law, and we knew what happened when you didn't obey the law. So we knew the rules and all of that at our home. And when my husband and I decided to get married, I sent my dad an invitation. And when he received it, he summonsed me to his house. And he was going to have a discussion with me. Well, in our household, you didn't discuss stuff. He told you how it was going to be, and you just did it. And I was done with that. I was finished being controlled and manipulated and told what to do. I was done. And I went because I was afraid not to go. And we had what was supposed to be a discussion, but it got loud. It got loud, and the louder he got, the louder I got, because I was finished being pushed around. And I remember I left that day. I got up in anger. I shot him a bird, and I left the house. And he said, "You better be sure this is what you want." And I said, "I am sure," and shot him a bird, and I left. And that was the last that I had spoken to him for 5 years. Well, fast forward 5 years, I came home from work, and my dad had sent me a birthday card, and it was on the kitchen table in his handwriting, and my heart absolutely pounded almost out of my chest when I saw it there when I got home from work that day. And when I picked it up to open it, my husband had already opened it. And I flew into what I know now was a total blackout rage. I leaped on him. I was beating him with my fists, or trying to. He was really just holding me back. And I'm climbing him like a tree, and I'm hitting and cussing and screaming so out of control. And I don't remember a whole lot about it. But I do remember that when it was over, I was so ashamed of my behavior. And I could see that I had no control over myself. I had no idea why I had even done it. I was embarrassed. I was scared for what I would possibly do to my own children through that. And I just went to God the next day, and I said, I don't care what you have to do to me. Whatever you have to do, I give you permission. I need you to get rid of this for me because I don't want to pass it on to my children. And so the journey began. And what I discovered is that God is very familiar with anger in his people. Now that is shocking to many of us because we know that explosive anger is sin. But what was so interesting to me about anger in the scriptures and in God's people through the scriptures is that God always came to them and initiated a dialogue. Now we see it first in Cain. Cain is Adam and Eve's son, and he murdered his brother Abel. Remember that story? And God goes to Cain and he says, Cain, why are you angry? And I thought that was so interesting that when I first read that, I sensed that God was asking me, why are you angry? And I was kind of surprised by that. I sort of just stopped and I thought, why am I so angry? Why am I so angry? And that's sort of where the journey began for me. God began to really start asking me these questions through his people in the scriptures. He goes to Moses and he calls Moses, Moses, he says. He calls him by name. And I felt him drawing me to him. Although I was terrified, I'll be honest, I was scared of God. I was scared of God in about the same way I was afraid of my father. And so this whole dynamic of, I wasn't looking at it like God was healing me yet. All I knew is I needed help with my anger, and God knew it was a sin and he was going to help me. And so what I saw there, though, in both Cain and Moses was this tenderness from God. He wasn't angry at them for being angry. Instead, he initiated a dialogue. He did so with Cain, he did so with Moses, he did so with King Saul, who was disobedient directly to God, and God said to him, why did you not obey? Now that's a gripping question for someone like me who grew up in this very strict environment of absolute obedience. No questions asked, you obey the moment that it's handed down, or else you bear consequences. So why did you not obey, Saul? And he tells Saul that obedience is better than sacrifice, which I found very interesting. Obedience, we want to give all kinds of stuff to God and we want to do it our way. We want to sacrifice in the ways that we like or that we think are more important or that we think are the best or more spiritual. And yet God says your obedience is more important than sacrifice. And obedience for me meant no more angry, aggressive outbursts. And I just thought, Lord, I just don't think that's possible. I don't know that that's even possible. And yet that was what he was calling me to very clearly through these people. He goes to Elijah and he says, Elijah, why are you here? Which we'll talk about in a later episode on depression. Why are you here, Elijah? Elijah was angry for lots of reasons. He goes to Jonah. Jonah, is it right for you to be angry? Now that was a big one for me. When God asked Jonah, is it right for you to be angry? I thought I could hear him asking me that. And I was like, you are darn right. It is right for me to be angry. I have every right to be angry. This is why, blah, and I just vomited all this rage, onto God. But what I discovered through these conversations that God was having with his people is that he knows we get angry, and not just angry, but murderously angry. And yet I saw very clearly that he wanted me to get this anger under control, because he says clearly, be angry, but sin not, in Psalm 4:4. And I read that and I thought, is that even possible? How can you be angry and not sin? I just didn't even know that was a thing. And yet when I read it there, I thought, okay, so clearly there's something I don't know here. But that became the basis of a tool that God gave me. Psalm 4:4 has in it what I call a stop tool. Stop. S-T-O-P. S is sin not. It says there, be angry, but sin not. Offer the right sacrifices and put your trust in God. And I thought, oh, okay, wow. So S is sin not. Not an angry outburst, not the cursing, not the throwing things and slamming doors and all the stuff I was used to doing. None of that. Then T is tell God. Meditate on your bed and be silent, it says. Tell God about it. Why are you angry, he says to Cain. Why are you angry? To Jonah, is it right for you to be angry? Have that discussion with God and talk to him about the circumstances behind why you're angry and what's caused you to be angry. And I remember that most of the time, because our vocations are the primary place of our formation, actually, it was usually most of our fights that my husband and I had. One of them was on our credit card, but the other was on, I'm too sensitive and he's too critical. I like to say he has the gift of criticism. And he would offer me this criticism, and it would wound me to the point where I just didn't even know how to take it. And I would explode in this terrible outburst. Well, God began to really confront me about that. And then I'm like, well, did you hear what he said? And then I would just sort of just throw up on God all of this stuff, that I was feeling. And he said this, and what am I supposed to do? But he says clearly in the stop tool, sin not, no angry outburst. T, tell God. And so I did that. I went to him and I told him all the circumstances behind what was going on with my husband and I, or whoever it was. It might have been someone at work. It might have been an employer. It might have been my pastor. Who knows? Lots of people made me angry then. So sin not, tell God. O is offer the right sacrifice. It says clearly there, offer the right sacrifice. And I thought, okay, so what's the right sacrifice? Well, it's going to be different in every circumstance. But I remember having conversations with God and being so angry, and him saying to me just very simply, Sonja, you need to grow up in charity. And I thought, okay, which means suck it up. And I thought, all right, then Lord, if I do that, I need you to take care of it though, right? I was willing to not say anything as long as God would take care of it. And then that's where the P step comes in. S is sin not, T is tell God, O is offer the right sacrifice, and P is put your trust in God. When he tells you to grow up in charity, and you don't necessarily need to say something here, Sonja, you just need to offer it in love. And my response was, okay, Lord, well, I need you to take care of it. And what he promises is that he always will. When we obey him in offering that right sacrifice, he will take care of it. And there was a one time in particular, I remember saying to him, I don't think I'm going to be able to let this go. I think I'm going to have to say something about this because it hurt so deeply and it was just so rude. And I talked it out, right? Sin not, tell God, offer the right sacrifice. So we talked it out, and I was able, after I was calm and I could do so in a loving way, I was able then to have that conversation with the person with whom I was angry. But do you see the process? He says, be angry, but sin not. That was a shocking revelation to me that could even be done. Tell God. He goes to his people over and over throughout the scriptures when they're angry, and he initiates a conversation with them so that they can discern what the roots of their anger are. It's not that God doesn't know. When he says to Cain, why are you angry? Is it because God doesn't know? Well, of course he knows. Cain doesn't know. Cain doesn't understand why he's angry really at the root, and I didn't either. I had no idea that my anger came from a wound. But as soon as God really began to dig around in there, wow, it was revelatory. I thought, so this is the answer. This is why my husband's criticism hurts so deeply. This is why I feel out of control in my anger. This is why I'm tearing things up. This is why people can't get along with me, or I can't get along with people. There is a wound there that causes that anger. Underneath anger, there's always fear. Fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, fear of worthlessness. And that's where God is really trying to get underneath. Now, a word about anger. In our focal text throughout the series, we've been talking about Hebrews chapters 3 and 4. And one of the things that it says there is that God swore in his wrath, they shall not enter my rest. In the Bible, we read a lot, especially in the Old Testament, about the wrath of God, right? And it's meant to scare us into doing whatever it is we're supposed to do. But the wrath of God is not like human anger. In fact, James says that the wrath of man does not work the righteousness of God. So very rarely is our anger a just anger. Now, there is a such thing. In fact, St. John Chrysostom says that he who is not angry when he has cause to be sins, because excessive patience is the hotbed of many vices, and it causes even the good man to do wrong. So anger in and of itself is not a bad thing. It is an emotion that God gave us as human beings, part of what images him. So emotions are not bad in and of themselves. What's bad is how we behave out of them. But God's anger is not the same as our anger. The word thumos in the Greek actually means an abiding resistance to sin. It does not mean an explosive reaction. It does not mean an act of revenge. It's none of those things that we associate with anger in other people. With God, it is an abiding resistance to sin, not an explosion, not a revenge. So, is our anger justified? Well, that's what we determine with God in the stop tool. When we sin not, we tell God, we offer the right sacrifice, and we put our trust in God. So during that, after I got that tool from God, I began to realize, okay, I am in control of my behavior. I am in control of my emotion, and God and I will work it out. He will help me. So I saw that very clearly. And because I had really begun to try to follow God, I fell into the trap of trying to be very holy. I was going to be a holy little Christian girl. So then I just pretended I wasn't angry. I was angry a lot, but I pretended I wasn't. Are you mad? Nope. Are you upset? Nope. Are you sure? Yes. Right? So that's not actually dealing with it properly either. What I saw there in that stop tool is that explosively angry behavior and suppressed anger are both destructive. And that is the simple definition for sin: destruction. Sin is not necessarily a do or a don't. It means destruction. It is something, in fact, it says in Romans, the wages of sin is death. If something is being destroyed, eroded by a particular behavior, you can bet there is sin involved. So when we act out explosively in anger, or we stuff it down where the explosion is interior, both of those are destructive. In fact, we know that suppressed anger is extremely unhealthy in every possible way. It is so unhealthy for us physically. It's unhealthy for us emotionally, mentally, spiritually. So it is as destructive to us as explosive anger is to other people. So the thing is, God expects and wants us to come to Him for that rest in our anger. Using the stop tool, He can help us determine why we're angry, if it's right that we're angry, and what to do next steps with our anger, and how to deal with the situation in a way that is beneficial for both us and them. That is what it means to rest from our anger. And what I have discovered over 2 decades now is that God is interested in balancing out the passions, the saints call them, those passions, those out of balance temperament and personality characteristics that we all have. He wants to just balance those. There's nothing wrong with them. There's nothing wrong with our emotions, but they do sometimes control us. And that's not only unbiblical, it's against the whole gospel. The whole gospel is that we have freedom in Him. We have freedom to be everything God made us to be. Personality, temperament, emotions, all of it. Fully and freely who we are without sin. And so when we are looking at the roots of our anger, we really need to go more deeply than just, well, I can't help it, or I just get that way. Because ultimately, that's not an excuse for exploding on other people or pushing it down until we're completely unhealthy. Because that's detrimental to both us and them as well. It's just a slow ticking time bomb. So my point here is then, God is interested in our anger. He initiates a conversation with His people in the scriptures that show He understands we get angry, and He wants to work it out with us. He wants us to have that dialogue that builds a relationship between us and Him so that we can get those behaviors and those emotions back in balance so that we can be all God made us to be, and we can rest completely in Him. That's my prayer for you. I'm Sonja Corbitt, the Catholic Evangelista, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
You can't always.
This is the death.
Remarkably
Turn back towards God. Rise up.